May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning, everyone. A beautiful and sunny Mother's Day to you today. I want to start this morning with the opening of Rob Bell's book, Love Wins. This book came out in 2011, and Bell is and was at that time the pastor of a large evangelical church. And at the start of the book, he talks about this art show that his church hosted on the theme of peacemaking. And one of the displays featured a quote from the great nonviolent civil rights leader Mahatma Gandhi. And Bell says that at some point during this art show, someone attached a note, a written note on the display, that the Mahatma Gandhi display, and the note simply said about Gandhi, it said, "Reality check, he's in hell." Again, for those of you who don't know, it's a very evangelical church, and somebody is making a comment that because Mahatma Gandhi didn't believe in Jesus Christ as his personal Lord and Savior, that he went to hell, ignoring everything that Mahatma stood for and lived and how he lived. So this is how Rob Bell responds in his book. Again, in the opening chapter, he says, "Really? Gandhi is in hell? He is? We have confirmation of this. Somebody knows this without a doubt. And that somebody decided to take on the responsibility of letting the rest of us know? Of the billions of people who have ever lived, will only a select number make it to a better place, and every single other person suffer in torment and punishment forever? Is this acceptable to God? Has God created millions of people over tens of thousands of years who are going to spend eternity in anguish? Can God do this? Or even allow this and still claim to be a loving God? What kind of God is that? What kind of God is that? I can't tell you how often I ask myself this very question when I encounter ideas about God like this that feel so limiting, where God is understood in a certain way, and that way becomes the only way. Ideas about God that so conveniently seem to align with our own human tendencies and prejudices and biases. Ideas that make God way too small. Smaller and less complex even than many humans I know, who seem to have a lot of capacity for tolerance and acceptance. And yet so often the God that many talk about is so much smaller and less complex than that. How is that possible? What kind of God is that? Well, in the book of Acts this morning, that beautiful reading that Roz read for us, Paul is wrestling with this same question. What kind of God is that? We're told that Paul is in the city of Athens, considered the philosophical and religious center of the ancient world. A city replete with monuments and temples dedicated to countless deities. So Paul is in Athens, and while he's there, he's invited to appear before the Areopagus, which was the Athenian council tasked with evaluating new ideas, right? So remember that the Jesus message was only a new idea back then. It wasn't as familiar as it is today. So he comes before the Areopagus, and his words to the council tell us a lot about what Paul perceived to be one of, if not the main obstacles or challenges that the Athenians were facing in terms of grasping the message that Paul was bringing. So he starts out with what this obstacle is, and he's dealing with it because that's what he thinks is the main issue to them grasping his message. So what does he say? What's the obstacle? Well, he starts out by saying, "Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and I looked carefully at the objects of worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, 'To an unknown God.'" That's how religious you guys are. "Well, what therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. And then he says this: the God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. So, the God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands. What's the issue? The issue is that the Athenians, in their valiant efforts to erect the most magnificent and unparalleled temples for their deities, enshrining them in opulent, larger-than-life marble and silver and gold, they yet suffered from one main thing, ironically, and that is that their God was too small. Their God was too small, not because of a lack of architectural or artistic grandeur or imagination, but rather because they believed that human-made things could contain the vastness of a universal God. And what Paul is saying here is that God is so much bigger than this. There's way more to God than you think. Many years ago, I was on one of those god-awful international trips, plane trips, where the layover was longer than the plane rides themselves. You know what I'm talking about? So awful. The first leg of the flight was so long, and I barely got any sleep. I was so exhausted. And when we arrived to our connecting airport, we got there at midnight, and the next flight wasn't until 10 a.m., right? And I already hadn't slept. And I get off this plane exhausted and crossing my fingers that our arriving gate had decent seats, you know, that I could just, and they were empty, that I could just lay down across them and sleep for the night. And I look, and the airport is empty, and yes, there's all these empty seats everywhere, except they had those armrests between the seats, you know. And so for the next 9 miserable hours, I tried to get comfortable any way I could. So I slept on the floor, on the ground, and then I slept upright in one of the seats. Then I tried to squeeze in under the armrests. It was just so miserable. You know where you're so tired that you don't care about life anymore? Like, that's where I was. I didn't care about anything. So finally, it's morning, and it's time for me to make my way to the other terminal where my flight was actually going to take off. So I get to the terminal, and I turn a corner, and y'all are not going to believe. The first thing I see are the biggest, most comfortable sofas you've ever seen in your life. I mean, these things were so amazing, and they were empty, and they're calling my name, except it's time to board, you know. And I couldn't believe it. All night, I could have been sleeping in these. Imagine if somebody like Paul had just come to me back when I was convinced that those seats with the armrest was as good as it gets. You know, imagine if somebody had come up and said, hey, you know, there's something so much better than this. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. Paul is saying to the Athenians, there's so much more here, guys. It's so much better than this. And that's what he's revealing to them. It's a compelling reminder by Paul of the immeasurable vastness of the God of the universe. And here's the thing for us this morning. Before we say, oh, that's really great that the Athenians got to hear that message, I want to invite us today to think of the ways in which we need to hear that message. The message of the immeasurable vastness of the God of the universe. The ways in which we, like every other person or people group throughout history, have the tendency to settle for a small God. We're doing it here this morning. Every one of us has the tendency to settle for a small God. How do we do this? Anytime we unintentionally confine God to our human definitions, doctrines, or demographics, we are settling for a small God. Confining God to our human definitions, doctrines, or demographics. Describing God using human terms and concepts. We'll just start with that. As though our imagination is even remotely sufficient to capture the sheer enormity of the cosmic creative entity that we call God. I think it's so small, for example, when people insist that we should refer to God only as Father, or using the male pronoun. And think of all the intricate aspects of God as Mother that we're missing in our worship because we are confining God to only one gender, right? Is it possible that the God of the universe, it says in Genesis, who made male and female in God's image, right? Not just the male in God's image, but female in God's image. Is it possible that God is just Father, right? Settling for a small God. Or I think of the ways in which we confine God to a particular religion with a set of doctrines, that you have to believe this in order to be saved. And just think about, I was just reading yesterday in a book about the how colonialism in many ways was started by a pope that was calling those who didn't believe in what the Catholic Church believed, calling them infidels. It's so interesting because we hear that language in other religions as well, who call those who don't believe what we believe infidels. And even though we don't often use that language anymore, we still kind of look at ourselves as keepers of the real faith, and those out here, they're not really connecting with God the way we are because we have the faith that has figured God out. Really, are we that certain that we figured out the God of the universe? Are we that certain? So let me just make a transition here and ask the question, why? Why do we do this? If this is so rampant, if we as human beings, if I'm going to stand up here and say that every person or people group throughout history has settled for a small God, how can I make that statement? Why is it that we do this, that we have this tendency? Well, let me just say counterintuitively that this tendency to make God so small, this is one aspect of humanity that is actually super beautiful, like really beautiful. Let me tell you what I mean by this. I'm talking about our ability as humans to take the complexities of the universe, that we're actually able to do this, right? This is amazing. To take the complexities of the universe and we're able to make them accessible through things that we can understand, touch, and identify with. Like, it's so amazing how we as humans have the ability to use our imagination and our built-in spiritual senses to touch something infinite. I mean, if that is not proof that we were designed for relationship with the infinite God, what is? So the way we do this is that we take what is by nature unfathomable and indescribable, and we make it small enough in order for us to catch a glimpse of that reality. It's so big, we have to make it small enough in order to grasp it. And one of the best examples of how we do this is when we're explaining to children big ideas that are intellectual or emotional, right? How do we do that? You don't just explain to your kid, like, for example, what divorce is and all the stuff that just happened between mommy and daddy, right? You don't put that on a child. Instead, you explain it in a way that is something they can understand. So this book, The Queen of Fire and the King of Ice, was written by a friend in Los Angeles who was wrestling with how to explain to her daughter that she and her husband were getting a divorce. And so she decided that she would put it in the form of a fairy tale, because kids understand fairy tales and it's got certain characters that are predictable. And instead of just saying, you know, dad's a you know what, You know, she wrote it in a way that made kind of the coexistence between the queen of fire, right, and the king of ice, not something that is possible, right? She explained it in a way that her daughter could understand and turned it into a book. So taking a concept that is too big and turning it into something that is small enough and accessible enough to understand it. And we as humans, as adults, as scientists who have access to what everything we can with our brains, that we do this with the infinite God. We try to take these massive ideas and we turn it into accessible things that we can then connect with. And it's amazing because we want to feel God as tangible. We want to serve God. We want to show our devotion to God. We want a place, a location where we can walk in and say, this place is dedicated to God. I feel God here. We do this as relational beings because we want to connect relationally with a cosmic God. It's a beautiful thing. Even Jesus, recognizing our need to do this and recognizing his absence physically from us, said, whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. I mean, think about what Jesus is saying is, when you connect lovingly to another human being and you give someone a cold cup of water, you're serving me. How practical and how accessible is that? It is a beautiful part of our humanity. The problem is, when we take these ways that we make God accessible and we start saying, that's the extent of God, right? So there's nothing wrong with making God small and accessible so we can connect with God, as long as we realize that God is bigger than that. Are you with me? I like to think often of, when I think of these kinds of things, I say, this is for me. This isn't for God, this is for me. So when I think of the kind of music I like, I don't say, this is the only kind of music God appreciates. This is the only kind of music that reflects the heavenly chorus, you know. I say, this is for me. This is what works for me. This isn't for God. I think we'll find it super helpful when we do this, to say this kind of language that we use, if the father language works for you, say, this serves me. But that doesn't define who God is. It doesn't serve God, it serves me. And I'll let you fill in the blanks with all the other ways in which you found a connection to God. Let's remember, friends, that God is so much bigger than anything we can fathom. And when we encounter others in our community or around the world who connect with God in a completely different way, not through Christianity, not through Jesus Christ, that if we find our tendency to be like, kind of like that person up front, although I don't think any of us are that radical, like, well, this is the way, you know, I'm sad for them that they don't know Jesus because they can't connect with God. Let's remember, this is for us. God is accessible in every way. And God's in control. And God makes sure that everybody can reach God. God is so much bigger than that. I want to close today again with the beautiful words of the Apostle Paul. Just sit back, let him soak into you today, and let it just turn you to a place of marvel. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything. Since he himself gives to all mortals life and breath and all things. For in him we live, in him we move, in him we have our being. Amen. God bless you, St. John's. Let's stand together for the Agape Creed.